By the end of this video, you'll have 5 best ways to use embossing folders in card making, plus 1 bonus and little known technique to quickly add dimension and texture to your projects with very little time and effort. For example, the bonus technique I'll show you in addition to the 5 will inspire you to use an alternative for embossing folders and help you stretch your supplies. Number 3 will give you ideas on how to enhance your embossed image with barely any effort. And number 5 will be a fun way to use up more scraps from your stash. But before we get into those, let's dive in with technique number 1. By the way, just a couple of quick tips before we get started with technique number 1. If you haven't worked with embossing folders before, it's worth noting that there are 2 types of embossing folders: 3D and a standard 2D. Tip number 1 is you'll have to be careful about the embossing sandwich you use in your machine, since you don't want to damage your machine. Once you've figured out the proper sandwich, write it down on the folder with a Sharpie for future reference. Tip number 2, the weight of your cardstock will also determine how well your image embosses. Heavier cardstock tends to emboss better and crack less, especially if you follow the next step. Tip number 3, spritzing the cardstock with a little bit of water will help get better details on your embossed image, as well as prevent the cardstock from cracking under the pressure. And the last tip, when you're embossing vellum, whether it's lightweight, especially if it's a lightweight vellum, you should add a card panel of the exact same size right behind the vellum in the embossing folder before you start embossing. The top layer should be your vellum and the bottom one should be your cardstock. Alright, so without further ado, let's get into technique number 1. For the first technique, I'm going to use this 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders. I didn't want you to waste your time watching me stick the washi tape to the card panel, so I've covered an A2 card panel with diagonally placed washi tape and secured the strips behind the card panel. I used this set of washi tapes, and in 2 minutes you'll see what a beautiful design it creates. I want to get an even row of flowers along the washi strips as best as I can, and ideally I want these florals to be lined up on the colored strips. Of course, not all of them will align perfectly, but I want to at least have the middle one centered so that it looks kind of straight. I don't care if it isn't completely straight, but I just want to make sure that the flowers are more or less symmetrical. And now that I've got the positioning kind of to what I was envisioning, I'm going to tape this folder shut just so nothing moves while going through the embossing process. The sandwich I'm using is plate A, the embossing folder with the card panel in it, and the adapter plate E. Time to reveal the design. And just look how beautiful this is. So I already have this pre-made card I usually get from Amazon, and I'm going to attach the panel here. And as always, I'm going to bring in my trusty magnetic glass mat. I'm going to apply some foam tape behind the panel to give it some more dimension, as if the embossing wasn't enough. I love dimension, so it's fine. And here is a quick tip. Watch how I only remove a little bit of the release paper before I start adhering the panel to the card base, because I find this is a fail-safe trick to get my card panel straight on my card base, and the half-released backing paper acts like a spring and prevents the panel from sticking down before I'm ready to commit. I just pull away the strips of backing paper and the panel is absolutely centered and straight. All I need to do now is add a sentiment and finish this card. By the way, if you're interested in the supplies I've used for each of these techniques, you can find the link to my blog, which has a visual list of all the supplies I'm using for each card project. Here are the photos of the finished cards. Are you ready for the next technique? I'm about to show you the perfect way to elevate the look of your embossed image. This works for most types of embossing folders, and this is a 2-for-1 technique to create 2 different looks. Let's get started. For this project, I'm going to use another 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders designed by Simon Hurley. And I will use this to create a textured background for an elegant floral arrangement. Wait till you see what I do with it. This folder in particular is very versatile because it can be used in several different ways. I'll make another video on this soon. And I'm using a black A2 panel which I'll emboss, and this is going to be my card front. So back to my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, and for this embossing folder, I'll use plate A. Actually, it's called a platform, but I keep calling it a plate. Okay, so plate A, the embossing folder with the cardstock inside, and then the adapter plate E. I very lightly sprayed the back of the card panel with a mist of water to prevent the cardstock from cracking. This is a really simple background technique, and look at how beautiful this looks. See, so much texture, right? You can embellish this any way you like. Keep it clean and simple or jazz it up. Now I want to highlight the texture by adding more texture. So what I'll do is use Simon Hurley's Lunar Paste and Astro Paste after to take this to the next level. A little bit of the paste go a long way, so I'll take a tiny bit of Lunar Paste on my finger and put some on the inside of the lid and rub it around with my finger to make sure I don't have any lumps. Now, I'll very lightly go over along the embossed lines here and there on the card panel. It's easy to clean up the mess on my fingers with a baby wipe, and while I'm taking care of the cleaning, I'm giving the panel a few minutes to dry. But since I've applied a very light coating of the lunar paste, it'll dry in seconds. Next, I'll apply a tiny bit of Astro Paste, which dries into a beautiful glitter without the dread of the shed. I love this paste, and if you're interested in seeing me try it out, I'll link to a short video in the description below. I'll just pick up a little bit of Astro Paste with my finger and apply it here and there. I wanted to add some really subtle glitter because I want this card to have understated elegance. Too much gold can be very jarring. Once more, I'll wipe my finger off with the baby wipe. It's that simple. Since the Astro Paste is thicker and takes a little more time to dry, I'm going to use my heat tool to speed it up because I want to show you the next steps. Now, I've already prepared a few things ahead of time to speed through the finishing part since this video is mainly about embossing techniques. So I didn't want to bore you by showing you a belabored process from start to finish. The sentiment is from Concordant 9th, and I cut it out using a Spellbinders label die. I've also cut out some vellum flowers and applied Astro Paste for that glitter effect to the petals. I used the Spellbinders Forsythia die, and I used a small branch since it's a smaller card, and then I used this die to cut out the flower petals. The vellum gives it a beautiful and delicate look. Now I'm going to put it all together, so keep watching and I'll show you the finished card at the end of the video. And if you're not afraid of getting your fingers a little inky after getting them all glittery and shiny, then this next technique is for you. It's also really simple but really pretty. Ready? Let's dive in. I'm using a 3D embossing folder from Altenew called Sunshine Flowers, and I've got a Canson 6x6 watercolor paper, and the reason I'm using 6x6 is that it fits into the folder and lines up properly because I can always cut the finished panel down to my desired size. Now on this paper, you can probably see there's a textured side and a smoother side. I'm going to use the smoother side for the project. The top or front of the folder is where the image is going to be embossed. I'm using Distress Oxides for this technique, starting with mustard seed for the flower center. I'll add the ink with an Altenew detailed brush and try to stay within the flower center for now. Next, I'm adding some seedless preserves very lightly, and I'm blending it in very gently within the petals near the center. For the leaves, I'm using crushed olive and adding the ink very sparingly and just tapping it into the recessed bits, and also a touch of lucky clover for a little bit of contrast. And I'm being careful to avoid the petals. I'm going to now place the smoother side of the paper facing up towards me into the folder, and I'm going to aim to get it as straight and centered as possible so I don't have trouble trimming the edges later on. I'm going to tape the folder shut on two sides so the paper doesn't shift while it's going through the embossing process. So for this, I'll be using plate A, the embossing folder with the card panel in it, and the adapter plate, which is E, and a shim. I know the outcome doesn't look like much right now, but you'll see it's going to end up looking absolutely beautiful. Now remember I said this was a 2-for-1 technique? Well, I'll reuse the leftover ink in the folder for the second option, which I'll show you shortly. Nothing gets wasted. This is a water brush and I'll use it to spread the colors gently by squeezing out a tiny bit of water every time. And this is why using watercolor paper is best, because it's meant for water applications and won't warp or buckle under moisture, which is exactly what we want. And as I blend the colors, I don't mind if some of the pinks and yellows mix together. It adds a nice effect to the flower center. And now I'll add drops of water here and there to activate some more color. I need a little more pink for the petals, so I'll just take a little bit off the brush since the blending brush is still loaded with ink. Now it's done, and I'll let the panel dry while I start on the second 6x6 panel. This time I'm going to spritz the folder lightly before placing the card panel in the folder, and I'll place it on the uninked side to prevent the ink from smearing. Now the second embossing uses the same sandwich setup as before. I love how this turned out, but we are going to enhance it even further. I'm just cleaning up the folder with a few sprays of water and a microfiber cloth, and I'll repeat the same process on these petals, but you see the colors are a lot bolder because we activated the ink with the water. And again, I'm just sampling a little bit of the ink from the brush and adding it where needed. I'm being careful not to let too much water flow through the brush, but just enough to blend. Look at how beautifully both of them turned out. They're very similar but different because the one in my left hand is a lot bolder. I love the softer look, to be very honest, but the bold look is also beautiful. Now I'm going to trim down the card panel because I want to place the panel, the emboss panel, on a mat. And this is the mat I'm going to use. And here's another quick tip. I'll cut out a section from the center of the mat since it won't be visible once the panel is placed over it. And I can use the centerpiece on another project. I'd love to know if you're like me and keep hoarding stuff in the name of stretching your supplies. I've used Gina K's master layouts, and I'll put which master layout this one was to cut out the center, which is a stitched square. I'm using Barely Art glue here. I'm applying foam tape to the back of the panel, but I just realized that I snipped off the corner. I can't believe myself. But I debated changing the panel up, but then I decided I'll cover it up and show you what I did so you know that it's not the end of the world to make a boo-boo. And I'll show you what I did to cover it up. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a fairly good try, which you'll see in just a bit. And I'm following the same principle of releasing only half of the backing paper from the foam tape, making sure I have the panel positioned correctly on the card base before pressing it down to adhere. So both the cards are now matted and adhered to the card base, and I will show you how I finished off the cards. Technique number 3 is really fun and easy. If you like a little bit of shine and glitter or a lot of it, it's totally your call. You love making the next card for any occasion, so keep watching. This next technique is super easy, super fun, and I'm going to make another 6x6 card. I've cut out a 6x6 card panel using Canson's mixed media paper so it doesn't morph under moisture from the sprays. I'll trim the panel down to size later on. For this project, I'm using a mix of distress and mica sprays. I don't have too many in my collection, but I'm going to use whatever I have and it's going to be all perfect. I just need to pay attention to the theory of colors when picking my sprays and make sure I use colors that mix well. Now I'm using this 3D embossing folder from Altenew called Snowy Stars. But first, let's bring in my cardboard box. I use this for what I call my messy maneuvers. You can see how messy it truly is. Now, this is the front of the folder where the design gets embossed. I can spray it on either side depending on the look I'm after, but I want the colors on the embossed side. So I'm going to spray the front of the folder, which is this side. You can see there's a lot of mica that's settled at the bottom of the bottle, so you need to shake the bottle, but you want to avoid going up and down like this because the nozzle might get clogged. Instead, here's a tip. Just swirl it around or roll it between your palms. I have another shimmer spray that's colorless. I forgot I had this, so I'm going to use it to up the shimmer a little bit more. Since I saw some spots that didn't have much shimmer, I decided to add a bit more of the sheer one. I'll use my heat tool to dry the panel so I could finish the card right away. I'm going to cut this 1/8 of an inch on each side so I can have a bit of the white card base showing from beneath like a mat. You can see how easy and effortless this card background is. And if you're in a pinch and you need a card really fast, I think this is a great way to get your card done. Of course, the texture from the embossing folder plus the texture from the shimmer sprays and the beautiful color and the distressed look just adds so much more than if I were to keep it plain. But I think adding this set of sprays is really bringing the card to life. I'm really excited to show you how I finished this card, but let's move on to the next one for now. This is another technique that helps to add textured spotlight to a card, and how complex or simple you'd like the design to be is totally up to you. For this project, I'm using a 5x7 card base, and I've also adhered a 5x7 panel to the card base to save time. I used this set of Spellbinders dies and cut out an oval from this piece of cardstock. I've cut out another set of smaller ovals from some champagne glitter cardstock. I think I got this from Amazon, so I'll find the link and put it in my list of supplies. Here too, I've tried to save the inside since I'm going to use the glitter frame as a mat behind the centerpiece and nobody's going to notice. I'll live up to my reputation as a hoarder and conserve this to use on another project. I just want that little bit of matting around the white oval to make the design stand out. I'll use this embossing folder from Amazon, but before I emboss this piece, I'm going to spatter some metallic watercolor on it. Of course, you can do this after you've embossed, but I just chose to do it before embossing. I'm adding a little bit of water to the paint to bring it to a consistency where it's not too thin, because although the spatters would be easier to create, the color won't be as intense. I'll use my heat tool to dry it really quickly so I can get on with the embossing. I'll use my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine as that's become my go-to for embossing. I honestly get the best results from the Platinum 6. I've just added 2 very light spritzes of water to prevent the cardstock from cracking, but also to get more details from the embossing folder. Now, if you're using watercolor spatters on the front, remember to not spritz the side that has the watercolor, because obviously that is going to bleed. Since this isn't a 3D folder, the light misting of water helps with the details. Time to reveal the panel. Wow, look at that. Beautifully embossed. I have some die cuts I picked out from my stash. I like to dig into my stash often to use the leftovers whenever I can. So I don't know exactly which colors I used for the distress oxides, but it looks like Victorian velvet, maybe antique linen, and I think shaded lilac. I'll apply the embossed panel to the mat or the frame, if you will. Now, once this is in place, I'll apply liquid glue around the edge of the oval to adhere it to the glitter frame. And since it's liquid glue, I can move it around a little bit to ensure it's perfectly centered, since liquid glue allows you a few seconds before it starts to dry. I'm going to use my magnets to hold the panel down so it adheres well. And before doing anything else, I'll adhere the embossed panel to the card base first before I add the die cuts. You know I love dimension, and the foam tape will also ensure the panel is well supported. Now this is done, I'm going to walk you through how I finished the card at the end of the video. This is the bonus technique I talked about, where I'm going to show you how to stretch your supplies. Basically, we use stencils for coloring, right? But in this segment, I'm going to show you how to emboss with them. I'm mostly speaking about single layer stencils because stencils with multiple layers could work depending on the design, but let me show you what I've done. I've taken heavyweight vellum, and this is from Salmon Set Stem. I've used the stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. By the way, they have a wonderful selection of stencils and card laying. If you want to check them out, the link is in the description. I've basically used the stencil to add the pattern, and you can see I've also created an asymmetrical gatefold vellum note card. Now I've already heat embossed the sentiment on this orange cardstock, which is going to go here. But let me share a quick tip with you, rather a hack, because if you've ever wondered how to remove the residue from the white anti-static powder we normally use for heat embossing, this is what I do. I first use a dry Swiffer to remove as much powder as possible without rubbing too hard. Then I use a regular eraser and gently erase around the sentiment. The key is to be really gentle so you don't rip the cardstock. And don't run the eraser over the heat embossing because it's going to dull the shine. The video is quite a bit sped up, but I'm actually taking my time with this step. Now, I'll use this fine tip eraser, which is actually an electric eraser, for more control, being careful to avoid the heat embossed areas. I won't use it as an electric eraser because I find I have less control over it when I use it in power mode. Now, I won't get all of the gray out, but most of it will be gone, and that's good enough. And after working with the eraser, you can see the cardstock looks more normal. All right, let's move to the next step. I'm going to line up my stencil on the stenciled image as best as I can, aligning with the ink blended areas, which is going to take some patience to do. But once I have the alignment correct, I'm going to use some washi tape to secure the vellum and stencil to the plate itself so nothing shifts during the embossing process. I don't want to emboss the entire vellum, so I'll place the plate strategically. I'm only going to place the plates over the vellum just before the edge of the stencil, which is lined up with the fold of the card. And then I'll run the sandwich through the embossing machine, because if the plates or the embossing mat extend beyond the stencil, the pressure from the embossing machine is going to leave an impression of the edge of the plate on the vellum, which I don't want. That's why I'm also careful not to cover the washi tape with the plates, because the pressure will also leave an impression of the washi tape on the vellum. Now, the sandwich I'm using is platform E, platform B, then the rubber embossing mat, and I like to give it a quick clean with a dry Swiffer before placing my vellum, just to remove all the gunk, because I don't want that getting embossed into the vellum. I'll add the adapter plate E and the shim F over the vellum and emboss it. If you're interested in details about how to use this method, I have another video linked in the description that will give you another idea. This method helps create subtle texture, which is great for backgrounds or just a little interest, as I've done in this case. You're probably able to see the subtle texture, right? I'm not sure how well you can see it on camera, but I can see it in person as well as feel the texture. Now, I'll just repeat the process for the other side of the vellum note card. So I will just finish up this card and I'll speed you through it because there's not a lot to see here. I keep this pretty plain and simple. All I'll do is attach the orange panel to the inside of the card. I'll secure it with some liquid glue, and I will then also use another white panel to put behind the vellum. That's going to cover up the glue that you would see through the vellum. You could use a double-sided adhesive sheet as well, but I just had the glue handy, and because I'm using the white note card anyway, since you can't really write a message on the orange card without it showing through the vellum on top, so the white panel that I'll add behind the card will be the place for the message, and it also serves to hide the glue. I think it turned out pretty cute, and I usually don't use a lot of bright colors on my card projects, but this was a challenge to myself. But over here I just realized that I had glued the orange panel upside down because I had meant the shorter panel of the gatefold to be on the right. Instead, it's now on the left. I mean, the recipient wouldn't know, but for me it was a little bit weird. We'll finish up the card by adding a piece of white jute twine to keep the card closed. And that is it. This is the completed card. And if you'd like to see how I finished off the other cards that I created earlier in the video, please keep watching. All right, let's talk about how I finished all the cards. Remember the one with the washi strips and the Spellbinders embossing folder I used in the very first technique? I applied this dark washi tape to a scrap piece of paper and then cut out the dies. For the happy birthday, I created a shadow with vellum and white cardstock so that the white gets diffused and won't look too stark against the background. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it really softens the white. Then I added these gems I got from Michaels and finished the card like this. The next set includes these two cards. For the first card, I had accidentally snipped off a corner, if you remember, while cutting the foam tape. So I put the sentiment in the corner there. It's not the best spot for a sentiment, but I didn't want to trash the card. I have the sentiment in my stash, so I used it. I also used Pinkfresh Studio glitter drops in Twilight. For this card, I used Card Blink from a Colorful Life Designs in Satin Light Pink. I finished it with another gold foil sentiment from my stash. Next, here's the card I created with the Spellbinders embossing folder, and I added a black strip of cardstock like a belly band to anchor the sentiment label. I had already cut out a small branch and flower using the Spellbinders Forsythia die set, and to finish it off, I used Pinkfresh Studio metallic pearls in gold. Later, I added 3 more gold pearls to the belly band because the center was missing a gold accent. So here's how I finished up this card. I die cut out the banner elements and the sentiment using Spellbinders dies and created the shimmery blue accents with a blend of ink and Simon Hurley solar paste. I just attached the entire banner onto the card front with foam tape behind it. I also embellished the centers of the snowflakes, which look like flowers, with some Pinkfresh gems called Enchanted Forest. This is the asymmetrical gatefold vellum card that I stenciled and then embossed with the same stencil. I love this rose gold envelope from Salmon Says Stamp. I kept it in the envelope because with the humidity in the environment, the vellum could warp, and I didn't want that to happen. I didn't really do anything beyond what you saw when I assembled this card. So just the stenciling and embossing in front and the heat embossed sentiment inside. I finished this one with the branch die from the Spellbinders Forsythia die set, some floral die cuts from my stash, including a label die for the sentiment. I stamped the sentiment using scrapbook.com's metallic rose gold ink and then heat embossed it with clear embossing powder to give it a glossy finish. I finished it off with some Pinkfresh Studio fluttering butterfly die cuts and champagne glitter drops. I also used one of my favorite paper tray sentiment stamp sets for this card, adding a simple happy birthday. And I added very narrow strips of foam underneath the butterfly wings close to the body so the wings wouldn't sit flat on the card front. The cards are all done, and here are all the cards that I made during the session, which actually required multiple sessions, but you know what I mean. I hope you liked this video. I'd love to know which one was your favorite technique and which one you'd like to try. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will be sure to get back to you. Thank you very much for watching. Now, if you like the look of vellum on your cards, you should check out this video here.